Declaration of Independence has been a fortifying and a defining document through U.S. history. And so I look at the Revolution. Obviously, that's how we declared our independence. Charlie Kirk called it the nation's birth certificate. And then, and I quote him right in the foreword of the book, and then in the last chapter, when he gave us an address, a speech at a church here last July 4th weekend. And he talked about the Declaration pretty much the whole time. But then I go to the Civil War and then World War II. So, and out of each of those things, you saw major changes in the law. And so each of those three sections ends with a chapter called Justice Established, kind of from the preamble of the Constitution. In order to establish justice for ourselves and our posterity, we're going to establish this Constitution. And so, of course, the Revolutionary War, we get the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And so it takes the ideas of the Declaration of Independence. We're endowed by our Creator with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And it brings those into actual law.
Hot stove conversations about baseball, history, football, and current events that may leave you saying there's more to consider. Now, here's your host, Jack Moore.
Welcome to another edition of More to Consider. I'm excited today. I have on Randy DeSoto. So I've mentioned often in the shows, I'm a law school graduate of Regent University in Virginia Beach, Virginia, in 1997. And the gentleman I have with me today, Randy, is a graduate from 1996. So we were in the hallway at the same time. We do the 1L, 2L thing. So when he's a 2L, I'm a 1L, and then he graduates 1 year ahead of me. Randy, how are you, sir?
Doing great. Thanks, Jack.
All right,
it's great to be on your show.
Thank you very much for being here. So you also have military background. You're a graduate of West Point?
Yeah, I went there in 89. Oh, I should say I graduated in 89 from West Point. I'd grown up in central Pennsylvania, and I really wanted to go in the military. My grandpa had been in World War II, and my dad had been in the reserves during the Vietnam era. But small town parades, Memorial Day parades and 4th of July and veterans. And I just looked up to all those people. So I really wanted to be involved with that. And so I applied for ROTC and West Point, and then I got accepted at West Point. And so I went up there, and it was really a great time learning. Reagan was the president. And so the American spirit was running high. And he came to West Point while I was there and spoke to us. And so to see my hero in person, who's actually in the book too and pictured on the cover, was a really touchstone moment for me. And then I was in the Army during the Persian Gulf War, although I didn't get deployed over there, but I was in tanks and the armor. And so we got ready and shots and wills and all that stuff, but then we didn't get deployed. But then afterwards, they were shrinking the Army down quite a bit.
Right.
And so I thought, let's get out. And I worked for a few summers with the Officers Christian Fellowship in their, with a Christian camp for military youth. And that was fun. And then I enrolled at Regent about a year out. And I'd seen Pat Robertson. He was on television on the 700 Club saying, hey, we're building this brand new law building. And he had the dean there, who was Herb Titus at the time. And he said, yeah, we're going to Christian lawyers. And I thought, I was a fairly new Christian at the time.
Right.
I'd become a Christian in 88 at West Point. And so that really appealed. I had been a poli-sci major at West Point. And so I thought, that's a good, I'm going to check this out. And so I liked it, and I went there, and it was a really rewarding time. And really the book came out of that, my time at Regent University. I'd written a paper in legal history. We had to do a paper to graduate, like a long form paper.
Right.
And so mine was about how the Declaration of Independence, it's the theological underpinnings of the Declaration of Independence came right out of the Western legal tradition. And so I kind of built that argument. And that's really what Jefferson said in his letter. He's like, I wasn't trying to argue anything new. I was just trying to encapsulate all the ideas that were going on at that time. So John Locke and Hugh Sidney, there were other people. And he's like, I'm just encapsulating. And even the arguments being made in these different political pamphlets, like Common Sense with Thomas Paine, all that stuff. So yeah, that's what my book is about.
Well, as a native of Virginia, literally going back to Jamestown and the Commonwealth of Virginia, you being from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and everybody that listens to me ad nauseum hears me say that I got a big baseball background, and I've just met so many neat people from Pennsylvania. And there's kind of a saying between Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, it's basically Alabama. When you get into Pennsylvania, it's very real people. It's a beautiful state. I think the world of Pennsylvania. And when you go back to the founding, Bill Bennett came to Old Dominion when I was in graduate school, and he said, if you're from Virginia, remember this. You had the guy that pretty much wrote the Declaration. You got the guy that pretty much wrote the Constitution, and you got the father of the country.
Yeah.
And he said this may have been the greatest collection of political genius in the world. And I was arguing with that with somebody. I said, stop and think about it. This whole American experiment, if you want to call it that, and I think that's kind of new agey or whatever, but to have Jefferson and Madison come out of the same neck of the woods, that's pretty strong. It's pretty strong to write those documents. And of course, Franklin played his part, certainly. And then there was greats throughout that time. But clearly, politically, Virginia was the most dominant state. 32 of the first 36 years, presidents from Virginia. And of course, nobody's from Virginia in public office now. All the people that are in public office in the Commonwealth didn't grow up in Virginia. It's a whole different thing. Virginia, it's its own, communist regime now, I guess. It's kind of changed from what I grew up with, but Pennsylvania is a special state for sure, special in the founding.
Yeah, I lived in Virginia for 10 years. So I went to Regent, and then I came back soon thereafter when I started writing the book, because I kind of needed the resources at Regent Library to pull this thing off. And this was before the internet was anything big, or it was probably just in kind of its infancy. And so I was like going and looking in these books, and the Norfolk Public Library also had a great old book section. You couldn't check them out, but you could look at them, and the woman there who was the librarian overseeing that was so helpful to me. But no, I love Virginia.
Did you ever run to Richmond to go to the state library up there?
No, I ended up at the state library in Pennsylvania was helpful to me. And then Regent's Library. And then I eventually moved to California. So this book was actually written coast to coast. And I lived right next to UCLA campus. And so I would go to their law school and their main libraries, which were also good. But I was thinking you were talking Virginia history. And of course, I used to go to Yorktown. I went to so many of the places in the book that I describe. And so I'd go to Yorktown and be inspired there. But I like that quote. John Kennedy, who I have on the cover, he has such a great statement about the rights of man, and his inaugural address come not from the generosity of the state, but from the hand of God. And so that's right, like 2 sentences into his inauguration. But he also has a great observation about Thomas Jefferson.
Yes. That's a great quote.
He was having a Nobel Prize winner's dinner. And so he gets up and he says, yes, I think this is the greatest assembly of minds here in the White House since Thomas Jefferson dined alone.
That's a great line. God bless JFK for that one. You're right. That is a great one. So you've written a book. What is that title of that book?
I titled it, We Hold These Truths. I have a little poster of it behind me too, but so we hold these truths. And the little tagline was 2 beliefs change the world. And so the original version came out in 2007, but I thought, gee, with the 250th anniversary, I got to get a new edition out.
Right.
And there's been so much that's happened between, in the last 20-ish years that I wanted to include some things about Trump in it, and Charlie Kirk, who I give real plaudits to in the book. I live in Phoenix, Arizona now. And so, Turning Point USA is here. And so I interviewed him a few times over the year. I'm a journalist now at the Western Journal, and I've been with them for 11 years. But so I interviewed Charlie Kirk a few times over the years. And then I would go to the America Fests, and they would have these Turning Point faith events where they'd bring in people like Eric Metaxas and others, and they just talk about the issues of the day. And so I thought, Charlie Kirk is like a Thomas Paine of our time, but is what I argue. And so in the book, it's 3 sections, and then I look at today. So I look at 3 major undeniably defining moments in the U.S. history, and epic, truthfully, in history. And I thought, I tried to build an argument, I guess, using my Regent law skills and whatever, to say, that can't be gainsaid in a sense, honestly. So I say the Declaration of Independence has been a fortifying and a defining document through U.S. history. And so I look at the revolution. Obviously, that's how we declared our independence. Charlie Kirk called it the nation's birth certificate. And then, and I quote him right in the forward of the book, and then in the last chapter, when he gave us a speech at a church here last July 4th weekend, and he talked about the Declaration pretty much the whole time. But then I go to the Civil War, and then World War II. So, and out of each of those things, you saw major changes in the law. And so each of those three sections ends with a chapter called Justice Established, kind of from the preamble of the Constitution. In order to establish justice for ourselves and our posterity, we're going to establish this Constitution. And so, of course, the Revolutionary War, we get the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And so it takes the ideas of the Declaration of Independence. We're endowed by our Creator with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And it brings those into actual law. Like the former dean of Regent University used to say, the Declaration of Independence was the founding charter of our country. And then the Constitution is the bylaws. This is how we're going to. So we have this idea. We want to say it's a company. We're going to build the best mattress or the best car or whatever it is. So this is our objective. So you set out the big goals in the Declaration of Independence. And then this is how we're going to organize our company so that we can build these things. And so that's what the Constitution is. And then the Civil War, of course, we had three major amendments after the Civil War. The freedom of the slaves, 13th Amendment, due process, 14th Amendment. Everyone's treated equal under the law is the 14th Amendment. And then the 15th Amendment was the right to vote.
Right.
And then finally, after World War II, I get into how we take our ideas and we help them get implemented in Germany and Japan and set the example really for the world. So, and then I look at today, arguing that we kind of lost our way. But although we're in 2007, when this came out, I felt like we were really losing our way. I feel like there's some signs we're getting back on track. And I certainly make that argument. So,
well, there's also the argument, I'm sure. I know it was written into a book, but I've heard this, just basically this outline that in every 20-year cycle, hard men create soft children and then softer children, which leads to hard times. And when you think about what you just said, it's funny about your timeline. The American Revolution to the Civil War is right around 80 years. To World War II is right around 80 years. And 80 years from that is now.
No,
And so when you think about it, I talk about my dad a lot on it. He was born in 1928. He was drafted during Korea, never was actually activated over. He was drafted and got an opportunity to go to OCS. He was a high school graduate, but his IQ was through the roof. So they put him in OCS. He finishes high in his class. He resigns his commission, gets out, goes in state police school, and is talked back into the reserves and makes full colonel. In 19 years from being recommissioned, from 28 to 47, he got full colonel. So he was really, he was good in the military, but all of his uncles were in World War II, including one that landed at Normandy. And he was a badass. When I used to talk to him, I used to realize he was a tough dude. So I knew those men growing up as a kid. I was born in 62. I'm guessing you were born about 67-ish?
Yeah.
So you're about 5 years younger. But if you were around that, and then I used to work on an Army base in the 80s, and I worked with Vietnam veterans. And I loved those guys, but they were some hard scrabble guys. They were tough guys. And they had been in combat. And you know that. If you're around certain kinds of people, but they carried the load when a country called upon them. And then they don't want their kids to suffer that, and it's generation after generation trying to make it a little bit easier for their kids. Next thing you know, we have today. And that's why I think you're correct. For the audience trying to hear where I'm going with this, I think things have gotten so bad. I'm listening to young people now. I still coach college baseball, so I'm around young kids. They're skewing very libertarian to conservative. They've kind of had enough. Now they're also baseball players, so I'm not around kids, maybe in other environments, but I'm hearing more and more from the kids what we might have thought we heard more growing up ourselves in a different generation. And I think it's because they're kind of at wit's end. Now on the flip side, we just see what happened in New York with the voting. They're throwing, socialism skewing towards communism. And I think people are just so frustrated. They're falling for it. But if I could wave a magic wand, when anybody ever asks me, what's the big problem? I'm like, public education. The capture for generations or decades of kids being taught the things they're being taught, and the capture of the government, they're creating good little statists. I mean, you're going to have a purpose of education, or you're going to have an overarching theme, and it certainly isn't what is in your book, you know. And when I taught in public schools, state-supported community colleges a few years ago, when I was teaching criminal justice, I'd open with, by what authority? And they'd look at me kind of sideways. I would read, brother, true story. I would read the Declaration. I'm like, what's Jefferson driving at when he says, if you don't meet these ends, alter or abolish? What's he saying? He's bringing about revolution, or he's declaring an independence, and it's written to the world. This is our justification for. And they're hearing it like, wow, he said that. You guys have heard this before. Never. You were not taught the Declaration in public schools. Never heard of it. Now, they knew about saving the whale or something. I mean, they knew things like that. But they literally had never, and you probably agree with this, they had literally never heard of the Declaration. I mean, they kind of knew it existed, but they didn't know what was in it.
No, yeah. And I have an article coming out on July 4th from Charlie Kirk's last, speech on this subject, or, last major one anyway.
Right.
And so he was saying that's the very point. And I quote some of that in the book, but he was saying that is the issue, that kids aren't being taught. He said, like, he cited a school like Turning Point had started, and then another local school here in Phoenix that, they are going through the Declaration line by line and paragraph by paragraph. But he said that's certainly the exception, not the rule. They aren't taught these things. He said there's a lot of talk about the Declaration, but there's not a lot of actually reading the Declaration. So if anything, people know the phrase, we hold these truths that all men are created equal, endowed by their creator. But Jefferson, the very first sentence of the Declaration of Independence is, in the course of human events, the government's become in conflict with the laws of nature and nature's God.
Right.
We have to lay out the reasons why we're going to be separating from England.
Exactly.
And so he says, we've been petitioning. It was almost like right out of the Bible. It's like the Bible says, when you've got somebody who's offended you, go with a brother up to him and say, hey, I feel like you've done me wrong in this area, Right. I mean, you can approach them individually too, but they went through kind of the Matthew 18 process. They kept trying to redress their grievances, and England kept coming back with more and more force until eventually they occupied Boston, military, martial law. They forced the local residents to house their troops. They shut down trade, which is the lifeblood of, people, their life. And then they started even shelling and burning some communities to the ground, like Norfolk got shelled by the British lead up before we declared our independence. And we're like, so they said, governments that behave this way have turned into tyranny, and we can no longer tolerate it. And so they laid out multiple reasons then in the Declaration of Independence why we're out of here.
But if you were to measure on a 1 to 10 scale, let's call it a 7. Let's say that the colonists thought that the rule of England at the time was in the 7 range. Where the hell is it today? I mean, if we looked at where would it be today in comparison? Like, I feel like what we look back at, I've heard it argued like they were arguing over 2% taxation, like, well,
now it wasn't just that.
Well, no, I mean, I know, but I'm saying, I don't know that the government that we now have accepted for almost 250 years isn't far more out of line. We could make the argument that today's government, as it relates to our association therewith, isn't worse. And yet we just kind of keep going right along and accepting it.
Yeah, I mean,
Did that sound like I just called for a revolution? But I'm just saying, it does seem like that what we look back at what they were offended by.
The grievances, yeah.
Yeah, the grievances. There may be argument that some of the grievances today are as bad, clearly.
Yeah, I mean, some of the scholars have been good, and of course, Mark Levin wrote a whole book about it, but, that the Supreme Court has gotten, out of line, like they have become the majority on the Supreme Court, with just 5 justices, you impose these nationwide rules. And so and Jefferson even wrote about that, the tyranny of the judiciary. Right. And so I guess if I were to label any area of our government that has those tendencies or could be problematic, it's certainly, and I go into this in the last chapter of my book, it's the Supreme Court. right now we have a conservative-ish majority,
Right.
with Amy Coney and John Roberts willing to jump ship, somewhat
Yes.
regularly. And that's been the history of things. I mean, it didn't go as badly, say, as Sandra Day O'Connor did for Reagan, or Reagan only got Scalia was his only solid conservative pick, I mean, and he was a superstar, but yeah, it's hard they get up there and they get into this mindset that they're, I think what's going on, like with John Roberts, say birthright citizenship. And I know there are arguments on both sides,
Sure.
but I truly think he thinks politically. I believe.
Mm-hmm.
I think he thinks he hears the arguments about packing the court and legitimacy of the Supreme Court and everything, and he tries to balance things out. Is my assessment. Like the argument on the birthright citizenship was so strong, in Thomas's and Alito's dissents. It's like, yeah, that's following the law. The Constitution says this, and da 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 da. And then Roberts was saying, oh no, anybody here in the country is subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. And it's like, no, that's not what it meant. But so those sort of decisions, and like Obamacare, other things
Mm-hmm.
like that, where he just jumps and he writes these opinions and sets policy for the whole country that is extra constitutional, I feel. But that's would be I think the founders would have that as their greatest area of concern. Certainly Jefferson would, and probably Washington. Washington's greatest concern was getting a government strong enough to keep the colonies together, that could tax, had a power of taxation and things like that. But, yeah,
you may have seen there was a series with Breyer and Scalia. They would go out and they loved it. I mean, they were best friends. But one of the most fascinating, and I used to show it to my classes when I was teaching, they were arguing about, they found in a Supreme Court decision, I think it came out of New Jersey, the controversy came out of New Jersey, you couldn't execute a minor. And so it became an Eighth Amendment argument for
Right.
Justice Breyer. And he's like, well, no other country does it. And I feel like society, there's an essence that was written into the Eighth Amendment about cruel and unusual punishment. And Scalia makes a good point. He goes, hey, I look back to the founding, and at that time, they were executing minors. They were executing minors, and they ratified the Eighth Amendment. So how? And then the same argument. I had a friend of mine, lawyer buddy. If I'd ever been in trouble, he'd have been my defense attorney. But he looked at me one day. We're at lunch having an argument, and he said, "That's what I was practicing in Chesapeake," and he said, "Clearly, the death penalty is unconstitutional under the Eighth Amendment."
Oh,
and
no.
I said, well, in the Fifth Amendment, it says that what can be twice placed in jeopardy is life or limb. So how can they in the Fifth Amendment be discussing your potential loss of life in the Fifth Amendment and be internally consistent with the Eighth Amendment if that is unconstitutional to take life? And he didn't really have a response. I'm like, if they're saying in the Fifth Amendment, without these certain protections, they cannot take your life, and that assumes that what can the government do at the extreme punishment? They can take your life. So I don't think that these same people who were executing. So my point is, that was Scalia's point, is he goes, I don't write the law. I'm a good lawyer. I'm not a legislator. So I have to look at the times and what do we think these people, he goes, but look, if New Jersey wants to pass a law not to execute minors, knock yourself out, take care of it. And I always thought that was a bigger problem with Roe versus Wade. And, I remember Dershowitz said it, Ginsburg said it, like, it's bad law. It's a bunch of justices when they're writing trimester they're writing legislation. And I'd have friends like, you mean to tell me, that a woman doesn't have I'm like, well, no, it's a state issue because there is no general police power in the federal Constitution. So states can define. I said, New York can say, as terrible as this is a state, New York can say, hey, we'll get you pregnant and give you the abortion. If you like that, live in New York. If you don't, go somewhere else. But it's not for, like you say, in a 5-4 decision, 5 guys or gals in robes writing the law for all 50 states based upon what they think is a fundamental right. Go ahead.
I thought, some of the professors at Regent, maybe it was in con law, and Herb Titus and some others talked about this, but I took him he did an off-campus course on the constitutional law. And so I took him in addition to what I was learning at Regent. So he had been the dean, but he was no longer the dean. But he really was strong. He loved the Constitution. But he went right back to Roe v. Wade, and he's like, the unwanted child, the unwanted fetus. I think it was like,
right.
And so then he said, so that's very, what's the word? It's not definitive. It's based on it's situational ethics, basically.
Right.
And so
it's not an objective concrete. It's kind of squishy. It's whatever you kind of want it to be.
Yeah. So it basically, and I argue in my book that it's based on the woman's state of mind. So so it's unwanted to her, but is it life or not? And so the Declaration says we're supposed to, and the Constitution says we're supposed to protect life, in the. But
again, I think as far as that decision went, it wasn't about any of that. Because when you really read the history, I think the first law in Texas, the one that was at question in 1854, really the prohibitions against abortion had been all medical. There'd really been concerns about the medical safety of the procedure. It wasn't about what we think of today with people that are pro-life. It's a life. They weren't even arguing that, but they put this law against the procedure. And that's part of what they wrote in Roe, like, oh, we're so much more advanced now and we can do this. But they did then go the route of the protection of the child against the state and against the mother and the mother's interest to terminate the pregnancy. So that's where they come up with trimester. Like, hey, well, in the first trimester, it's kind of mom over child. Then it kind of gets in the squishy middle, and then the child
by the last,
yeah. And then but that is all legislative. My whole point is, if Alabama would be the last to, but if New York wants to write that law, abort them 15 days after conception, if you don't like it, move out of New York. But I'm thinking it's New York's jurisdiction to say so. So Rehnquist, when he wrote the dissent, said, we don't even get to this. We don't need to get into this argument. It's a fundamental right or the right of the child against the mother of the state. That's not for us to say. It's for each individual state to define life and when it ends. Yeah.
Alito, in his Dobbs decision was so good on this. He laid it out so clearly and powerfully. He was just saying this is a state issue. They made it up whole cloth, and then Planned Parenthood versus Pennsylvania, they just kept it going. They started to allow some restrictions that states could enact. Saying, oh, like you said, during the first trimesters, no, but later, and then parental consent and these sort of things could all be brought in. But
they got the nose under the tent with the Griswold decision. People forget that Griswold was the contraceptives in Connecticut case. And that's where they started to leak the language in, like, oh, well, some married couples certainly has the right to practice whatever type of birth control they want to in the privacy of their own bedroom, blah, 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 because they have a privacy interest. That's 65.
A penumbra.
Right, penumbra and emanations and all that. Yeah. Also, so they get that framework, and it was all set up because it was Planned Parenthood people that basically, hey, arrest us for a violation of the anti dissemination of birth control types of devices, indoor literature. Oh, you arrested us. Let's make a test case. And that's what they did. So when they get Griswold in and they go contraception, and again, Joe Q citizen on the streets, like, hey, if Marge and Bill are practicing, whatever birth control in their home in Connecticut, does Connecticut, who's a heavily Catholic state, really have the authority under laws to say that that's against the law? And people are like, nah, come on, But that's a Connecticut issue. But they got that in, and that was the forerunner for that really set up Roe versus Wade. So,
no, that's how these step things work. But
absolutely.
I pointed out there's a contradiction in the law even now. So, and I set up the scenario. Of course, law school is great for hypotheticals, but say a woman who's pregnant has the intention of aborting her baby the next day. She has an appointment at Planned Parenthood or whatever. But in the meantime, the disgruntled boyfriend or somebody shows up, you know, and he doesn't know this, or whatever scenario you want it to be, but she's attacked and the baby's killed. That's murder under the law, or manslaughter at the very least, depending on the law and the situations and whatever. So we recognize the right of the unborn child in those sort of scenarios. You attack this woman with intent to harm her or her child, and you've killed this unborn child. You're going to jail. Assuming the jury can be convinced, et cetera. But on the other hand, so she's free to do it otherwise. And so it's like her intention was to do it one way or the other, but it doesn't matter under the law, the way the law currently stands. It's that, I think in every state and federal law, but that child is protected. Well, it's primarily a state issue.
Well, there's one of my favorite, there weren't case books, but one of the books that I had when I was teaching criminal justice had almost that exact scenario in it. And it was interesting, the young people's reaction. This was 15 years ago. So it would give almost like case law, like we studied in law school. It would give a case, and it was always extreme examples, extreme facts. So they have a case in California where a guy estranged from his wife finds out she's pregnant. He confronts her and says, I know you got knocked up by another guy, and I'm going to kick that baby out of you. So he drop kicks her, stillborn, baby dies in womb, and he gets charged with the death of the unborn child. And he gets a good lawyer. He appeals that conviction, and he shows that the California law at the time said that homicides related to potential criminal punishment has to be a live person, a person after birth. And he walks on it. And I got kids in the class. Well, that's not right. He even said, I'm going to kick the baby. He's knowledgeable of the life. And I said, yeah, but hey, they're right. And the courts were like, we don't really like this guy, and we don't like the fact pattern. But if the law at the time, and the legislature for California within a year amended the statute to say that would have been a crime. But at the time, but I just thought that's fascinating. In a world of, like you say, in a world of acceptance, like, well, it's absolutely a woman's right, to choose. Now the status, and you say that one day before, the status in this case where the guy identified, you are pregnant and I'm going to terminate this pregnancy. That is my intention by kicking you. He does it. And it would be no different if she shows up the next day. What he's doing, we're calling a criminal act. What she's doing by her own consent or will
is a right.
Is a right. Exactly. So that is interesting. And on the flip side too, I remember getting into philosophical discussion with a group of lawyers one time in an office. And I said, well, let me ask you this. Why can't a guy go to a female who has had the quote unquote, the pregnancy out of wedlock? And he goes, look, I'm going to be on the hook for 18 years. Here's X amount of money. I'm going to throw in an extra 20%. I'm going to pay for the abortion and give you some money. Go terminate the pregnancy. And let's contract. If you're going to have the child, I made the offer. I'm off the hook. And this female friend of mine said, absolutely, he can't do that. He's on the hook for 18 years. It's his child. And I said, well, then why is it he can't buy her out and offer to terminate the pregnancy? Because if she goes to terminate the pregnancy, he's got no voice in the child living. And she goes, no, that's not his choice either. And I'm like, well, you're a lawyer, and I'm like, do you not see some imbalance in that thought? She can terminate the pregnancy. He knows it's his child, and he can't tell her, carry it to term, I'll take care of it. Mom and I will help take care of it. My mother, I got a whole line of people that will take that child to maturity. Nope, not your choice. Well, then let me buy you out of the pregnancy. I'll pay for the abortion. I'll even throw a check in to take care of whatever other mental things you may be going, whatever. I'm going to pay to terminate. Nope, he doesn't have that choice either. And I'm like, kind of from a standpoint of just sort of what it seems like justice or logic, that doesn't seem to line up. Go ahead.
No, yeah, I was when you mentioned the idea of counseling or whatever, that's a really good point. Because I think, again, going back to natural law, people's consciences can be seared and whatever. And I know I'm sympathetic to certainly young women or any woman who finds themselves in a pregnancy they weren't wanting or expecting. And all the emotions that involve with that. But
Sure.
you hear, obviously I'm a man, but you hear these testimonies of women later who deal with major guilt and
Oh, absolutely.
and shame that and regret that they don't have this child that they could have had. And then you hear the stories on the other side. And I'm sure you can get it going both ways. I know you see some of these celebrities, boy, having that abortion really helped my career and da da da.
Yeah, sure.
But you have so many women, testifying that I'm so glad I had this child, and now they're in high school graduate or off to whatever. And so it's really life affirming and heartwarming when you see. And it was hard. I was a teenager, or I was in a bad place in life, but I made the hard choice and we went through. And I think God helps people in that situation. I know he does. He's the father to the fatherless, it says. So yeah, I know it's challenging, but in a moral world and in a world where the Declaration of Independence says that there are certain God-given rights and God forms us in our womb, the Bible says, in our mother's womb.
Right.
Those are truths. And so whenever we try to contravene truths as a society, there's a price to pay, and it's a devaluation of life. And, that plays out not just certainly with pregnancy, but in general, like, we're just this product of evolution, the strongest survive. And if I got to kill somebody or whatever, I'm going to do it. So it leads to lawlessness. But yeah, I was thinking another area that Scalia was so good on is when the sodomy case in Texas, was it Bowers? And then
Texas, right.
Yeah. And so he said, it's only going to be a short time. So they said, states can't enact laws about that kind of stuff. It goes back to the idea of privacy. And yeah, I go. It was an old law. Most states didn't have any laws about sodomy or anything, but Texas still did. And so originally they said in the first iteration of this at the Supreme Court, they said, it's a state law, and if it's not a constitutional issue. If they want to address it, they can address it. And they went and said, basically according to the laws of nature, nature's God, it is prohibited. And so the states have the police power, as you said, so they can pass the law or not. So then we get 17 years later, and the Supreme Court says, no, there is a God-given right to do this. And so Scalia wrote the dissent, and he said, it's only going to be a short period of time before they say, and there's a God-given right for same-sex couples to marry. And even though the Bible says he creates us male and female, and he creates marriage, and for this reason, a man shall leave his father and his mother, and the two shall become one. So, and he was right. 4 months later, the Massachusetts did that, citing the U.S. Supreme Court in part. And then, of course, we got at the Supreme Court level during the Obama presidency, where it's now this constitutional right. But it's not consistent with the laws of nature and nature's God.
Well, but I do think, though, if you go all over the map on this type of stuff, I am madly libertarian. I'm probably the anarchist libertarian. I do not trust government. I don't like government. Once again, I'm not calling for revolution, but I'm just not a fan of government. But I would agree that if you're looking at that Bowers case in that time frame, if you're going to be internally consistent or intellectually consistent, you have to say, hey, it's Texas, knock yourself out. There's no God-given right or recognizable fundamental right to sodomy. And I remember the police, they're in there searching for something else, and boom, walk in on two guys or something. And then it's like, whoopsie, we caught him in this act. And it was kind of a plain view exception type of thing. They were legally standing where they stood. I don't remember what it was going on at the house where they entered this room, but they found this. So they charge him with what was then the law. It clearly was the law. So again, I don't think that's something the Supreme Court should have dealt with, and then when the thing started happening, what was it? 94 was it under Article 4? Was that Section 1 or 2 where you get into the recognition of other states in their papers and decisions or whatever, the status, where they get into the whole thing about what's going to happen when some states begin to legalize same-sex marriage. So the other state's going to have to recognize those. And the Protection of Marriage Act was basically saying there is a clause within Article 4 that says it can be regulated by Congress what those lines are. So the states are coming up and saying, I would have thought again at that same in that same mindset, it would have been up state to state. It does get unwieldy, though, if you're a gay couple married in California, you move to Tennessee, and Tennessee, we don't recognize that. Then what are you going to do about it? I'm from Virginia. My father literally defeated. I talked about him going to state police school. He was the man that defeated the sheriff that arrested the Lovings. Mildred and Richard Loving. I went to school with their kids. So what happened is the Lovings, of course, went to Washington, D.C. and got legally married. But under the Racial Purification Act of 1924, it was one, illegal for a white to marry a non-white, and two, to leave the state to avoid the law. So they had 2 felony charges. And those were legitimately federal felony charges at the time. So where they really got hit was they came back to Virginia, legally married in D.C., and got arrested for it. Now, the Supreme Court eventually in 1967 overturns that. They overturn that decision, and they basically say you can't have laws saying that couples cannot marry regardless of race. And most people would agree with that. Now, that's one of those, is that a fundamental right to marriage? Is that something that all the states? But my point is, I always wondered why. I've listened to the attorneys talk about this. They didn't challenge the marriage based upon like an Article 4 recognition of a status that they'd achieved in another part of the United States legally. They went after the whole thing about it being racially discriminatory, et cetera. But I think that was an argument too. They're legal. Why are they legally married in D.C. and can't travel to Virginia? I mean, it's certainly another door to open and try to explore. But yeah, I don't care how you go on this stuff. When the states are in conflict with law, there's going to be a mess. There's going to be somehow a mess with that. Are you back to your book? What are the other things you wanted to talk about? You're talking about these 80-year cycles and where the country is. What are these other fundamental truths that you believe were established in the founding documents and maybe have been lost over time?
Well, the 2 main, where I have the tagline, 2 beliefs change the world. The 2 beliefs I believe that changed the world were that we have these fundamental God-given rights.
Right.
And providence, this idea that God foresees what's going to happen in the world and that he oversees in the grand scheme of things what happens in the world. And that was the faith that kind of in the Declaration they talked about, as in the document it closes saying, appealing to the supreme judge of the world, who's Jesus, by the way.
Right.
That's what the Bible tells us. And then and a firm faith in divine providence. We mutually pledge our lives, fortune, sacred honor. So that, I argue, that's how we became the land of the free and the home of the brave. If you have a faith that God is on the side of justice, then you're willing to lay it all on the line and trust him for the outcome. If you feel like you're aligning with what his principles are, that we're supposed to be free, that governments aren't supposed to imprison us and, for no reason, like the British government was, taking people and making them serve on their ships and burning their towns and all that stuff.
Impressment, I think it was.
Yeah, impressment, all that. So they truly believed, and the Great Awakening had just happened, in the years prior to all this. That was just in a movie, and that's some of that stuff's in my book about Ben Franklin and whatever. But yeah, this was the faith, and Charlie Kirk said this in his message last 4th of July. The reason that the United States, he said, if you'd put it in poly market odds, if you were betting, if they had poly market back then, it would be a 99.9 to 0.1 that the American colonies could beat the British, who had the most powerful army and navy in the world. And so it was faith, he argued, that makes the difference. And that's the point of my book too, is that this, so in each of the 3 sections, I kind of go through periods where that faith was strengthened. They went through trying times, as Thomas Paine talks about. But like in the Battle of Long Island, I don't know if you've ever heard of that. The jig was kind of up. The revolutionaries had forced the British out of Boston. They brought in some cannons from a captured fort in New York, and it forced the British to evacuate Boston. But then they showed up in New York, and Washington had some of his men on Long Island and some of them on Manhattan. And then, because they weren't sure where the British were going to land and attack. And they came on Long Island, and they came in large numbers. And Washington had about, several thousand people there. He had about 10,000 total, as I recall at that time. So maybe about 5,000 were in Long Island, the 5,000 Manhattan. And the British show up with like 30,000 troops, and they put like 15,000 of them on Long Island. Just giving a sense, they were greatly outnumbered. And so the weather changed in a way that saved the American cause, because they could have used their ships to come up the East River and kind of trap those troops on Long Island. But as they were moving in towards the American defenses that they'd set up, it started to rain hard. And so they called off the invasion for one day. And then Washington, they had just gotten some soldiers in the last month in from Massachusetts who were really good with watercraft. And so they had arrived really in a good time, in a timely manner, which someone called Providence. And so they came up with a scheme to get all the troops evacuated during the course of the night over to Manhattan. And so they started doing that, but then it wasn't going fast enough as the daylight approached. And they were going to be sitting ducks with the remnant that was there, say 2,000. And but a fog came in. He said it was a peculiar fog, firsthand accounts said, like one of the colonels who was there, and it blocked the British from being able to see what was happening. And so, but it was open where they needed it to be able to get over to Manhattan. And so they kept ferrying people across, and then Washington was in the very last boat that pushed off, and they went over to Manhattan, and the fog lifted, and so the British went in there to see just smoldering campfires and all the Americans gone. And it was one of many instances where people would say, God has been helping us in this thing. Because if Washington had lost half of his troops at that point, forget about it. They were already outnumbered 3-1 or more. And
I see, and you and I as being believers, here's where my tension always is. You and I could see that someone that's not a believer, or whatever their particular worldview is, poo-poos it. That's just how human nature is. People can see it how they want to. But I also think often about how history, as is talked about, is written by the winners. And I'm not questioning anything you just said, but what I found fascinating is I remember reading this historian. He was talking about the Revolution and how, in the time frame in our existence, we came along, because with this 250th anniversary, now I'm guessing you were about 9 during the 200th anniversary of the country.
Yeah. No, it was so fun. Yeah, it was so fun.
Well, and when I was 14, and I was telling a young person the other day, I remember they came out, they had all the quarters that were coming out with Washington and some kind of themes relative to the 200th anniversary. Ford was president. The election was that fall, but they're lighting things up, and it's a lot. I never remembered any degree. We're coming out of Vietnam. We're coming out of Watergate. But even in that time, I remember it being a festival, and I remember it really being, the great ships. They were bringing in all the ships into the eastern harbors. I can't see any of that happening right now without total polarization. It's like hate Trump, like Trump. If Trump's involved with it, it's going to be ugly. So I don't see a unification under that. But where I wanted to go with the war, I read this historian, and it made perfect sense. He said, really, when you look at the numbers, when the whole Revolutionary War starts, or when there's the buildup for that break, about a third of the colonists are really behind it. About a third of colonists are against it, and about a third are waiting to see who's going to win. And I'm thinking, okay, so I'm teaching American history a few years ago, and I'm kind of painting by the numbers. I'm doing the regular thing. And this young lady comes, I'm at Tidewater Community College in Virginia Beach, Virginia. And this young lady starts coming up from the back, kind of laughing. And she was a freshman. And I said, so young lady, what's so funny there? And she goes, you Americans, clearly a British accent, you Americans in your American Revolution. And I said, well, how did they teach it in England? And she said, it got too expensive. It got boring. It was too costly. We came home. And I thought, kind of makes a lot of sense, because even at the Battle of Yorktown, Cornwallis's surrender, it's not like they could have turned right around the next day and just brought more forces. They still were the strongest navy and maybe the strongest military in the world. And it has been argued that the War of 1812 was the last battle of the American Revolution. They're still pestering around on the Americans, and they come over and they burn the White House. And then they kind of finally decide, okay, it's over already. But it's continued to be a squabble. But what I'm saying is we can see a lot of divine things going on. It might be true. It's clear to say if we've turned our back on God as a nation in the way you and I both know we have, look where we are. I mean, that's kind of makes sense. But I also recognize that we had a vested interest as Americans. It's seeing the American Revolution as a very inspirational story, when in reality, especially in the Deep South, where more Tories were, they're trading the cotton to England. This comes up in the American Civil War. There's still a little, and I remember the British. I remember some of the editorials I read. I'm sorry, Union Army, Lincoln. What's that about? They don't have the right to break away. What? And the Southerners often refer to it as the Second War of Independence. Aren't they saying we're doing the same thing that our forefathers did? And then England was like, wait a minute, Union or, Mr. Lincoln there. Why can't they do? You guys told us that 80 years ago you could do that. And I mean, there's kind of an argument to that. So the very same South, who has a whole different financial structure, does have a vested interest in keeping good terms with England. It's where they're kind of selling the cotton to in large part. So there's a lot more dynamics to it. History's much messier than everything was beautiful, there was a divine cause, and it all just kind of happened that way. Because people fight for their interests too. And that 1/3, like I said, that was sitting back and waiting to see how it was going to turn out. Can't you see being a merchant? Like, I don't care if England wins or the new colonists win. Just settle things down so I can trade. So I can do whatever.
Yeah, it doesn't affect my life. So that was John Adams' assessment. He said it's about a third. A third were strongly for it, a third were indifferent, and then a third were against it.
Yeah.
I guess I would argue the difference between, I know Lincoln was doing his best to keep foreign powers away from the United States during all that too, because they were very
Well, the Emancipation Proclamation was in large part because of that. He was making it a moral issue. And that's another thing about Lincoln. If you read Lincoln going into the election of 1860, he's very indifferent about freeing slaves and all the rest. He just wants to keep the Union. I mean, once he realizes that the South is going to secede, it starts with keep the Union. And I think it's fair, he's a politician, that it became, if I can make slavery a moral issue, I can keep England out because they've already abolished slavery. And I think that was a lot of it. He needed a victory, and he got enough of a victory at Antietam to say, okay, I'll draft this and make it effective January 1. But so people are much more complex in their historical significance, or the way that they're operating within certain parameters are much driven by the circumstances of their time. It's just they're not clearly that angelic or demonic. They're just people. Fair?
No, the opening chapter of my Civil War section is about Lincoln's call to action. So I kind of go through his evolution. And of course, at Cooper Union address, he made the case. This was before he was president, but it became a platform in 1860. He made the argument that the founders, through their actions that they took, validated the idea that the federal government had authority to decide whether slavery would be in the territories. And so that was the Republican position. It's like because that was becoming the issue, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, whether people could choose from themselves, whether their state, or whether the federal government would dictate if it was going to be slave or free. And the Missouri Compromise had been above a certain parallel.
Yep.
Those states would all be free and the ones below would be slave. Yep. And so Kansas and Nebraska were above, so they were supposed to be free. And so Stephen Douglas, Lincoln's rival, had passed legislation saying we're going to let local people decide
popular
sovereignty. Whether you're going to have slavery. One of the powerful things I tried to take on the book is I have a little section called Slavery at the Founding, because that's one of the big digs against, like you said, during the Civil War and others, is they're saying, we were a slave country from the start. and they validated it in the Constitution. But I kind of look into that. I look more closely. Of course, 1619, we know that slaves were brought into Virginia. So for 150 years, there'd been slavery, and it was part of the economy in the South, especially. But Franklin had slaves; he freed them, and then he became a president of the Abolition Society.
Right.
But we need to. Jefferson actually has some pretty good. He was a slaveholder, but he also took some pretty powerful steps to abolish slavery. He had put it in He had put it in the Declaration of Independence, and then they got taken out.
Exactly.
Slave trade is horrible. What's this?
Well,
Christian
he attacked the crown. He said he attacked the crown for basically saying you set up the circumstances of the stain of slavery we carry.
Right.
And then I think some other guys around the room were like, okay, TJ, okay, we can hit him for some
dial
things,
it back.
But you're right. And it's interesting coming from him because we live in this world of dynamics, but he actually owned slaves. But and he also died $106,000 in debt, and basically his creditors owned his slaves. In effect, he was totally impractical as a person when it came to finances. But I've read a lot that he influenced some people who had the authority and or the means to free slaves to do so. So when you read Jefferson, he's complex.
I just want to, while he was president, so go back to the Constitutional Convention. He wasn't there, but he was an ambassador in France.
Yep.
Yeah. But in the Constitution, they made some provisions to start, as Lincoln putting it on the glide path to extinction. It's certainly, and you need to know that by then, a lot of the states in the North had already abolished slavery, including Pennsylvania.
I think Pennsylvania was first, right?
I'm pretty sure 1780s, I recall.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure they were first. Yeah.
So and that's where the Declaration was signed. But
Amen.
So by 1800, all the states had passed legislation north of the Mason-Dixon line, north of Maryland border. Had passed this legislation. So these are the first governments in the history of the modern world that are doing this. It wasn't England. England was still decades away. We as a whole nation didn't abolish slavery until, 1865 really, but 1863 was the emancipation. So that began the process. But
sure.
So in the Constitution, they put a provision in that 20 years after the ratification, that the slave trade could be ended. So we'd be getting no more slaves in from Africa or the West Indies or whatever. And
20 years of importation until 1808, I think. Yeah.
That was the compromise.
Right.
And so in March of 1807, Jefferson is president. The legislature passes a law saying this is what we want. So they had the power to do it. They didn't have to do it, but they did. And they passed this legislation saying slave trade will end January 1st, 1808, the very first possible date. And Jefferson signed it into law, and that was the law of America. That was within the same time window that England did it too. William Wilberforce and all of his efforts. So they ended the slave trade on their side then too. So it was all happening pretty much simultaneously. And but we acted is what I'm trying to. I just one other thing. The Northwest Ordinance was passed in 1787 while the Constitutional Convention was going on across the street.
Exactly.
And that outlawed slavery in all the Northwest territories, Michigan, Ohio, what would become these states, Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. They actually have a pretty good record on slavery at the founding, given the history of the world, et cetera.
Well, and I've done this several times on shows because I thought it was fascinatingly bad, or ignorant or whatever you want to call it. And I'm kind of given the Schoolhouse Rock definition of what I think the facts are. But I remember in one of these, Matt Gaetz taking on a General Milley, he said, hey, are you kind of happy with what's going on in the Army right now where they're teaching whites to feel their white guilt and understand their white rage or whatever? And he's like, yeah, I've read all the great philosophers, Marx included. He goes through all these different, doesn't make me a communist, but he goes, well, when I look at a country that once said that a African American was 3/4 of a human, blah blah blah. And I said, well, first of all, you got the fraction wrong. And I remember a black female friend of mine one time. I was talking about the genius of the Constitution, which I think basically is here's where the lines are drawn, kids. It's not really a document that I think carries with it a great level of moral play. It's really just basically the function of the government. All the checks and balances. The bylaws. It's the mechanics of it. But I said, so I said, why do you have a problem with it? She goes, well, it wasn't written for people that look like me. I said, based upon. She goes, well, the document itself says I wasn't fully human. And I said, do you know what the 3/5 compromise was about?
Yes.
And she said, well, I just know that they defined blacks as 3/5 of a person. I said, actually, what happened was the abolitionists wanted you to not have representation at all in counting for the census because you had no vote and you had no citizens' rights. She's like, what? I go, oh yeah, the South was all for slaves being counted as whole
100% a person.
Yeah, absolutely. And then she's like, tell me more. And I said, well, when it says 3/5 compromise, the Northern abolitionists were saying, South, you can enslave 4 million people and then get greater representation in the House of Representatives, which is what the census was being counted for, was to decide how many people are within the several states. I've never heard this. I'm like, okay, so so when Millie goes 3/4 of a human, again, he gets the fraction wrong, but I'm like, he's a Princeton graduate, a 4-star general. I think at the time, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I'm like, how are you throwing around the three? And everybody makes mistakes, but 3/4 of a human, if you're Princeton graduate and you're in that position and you're testifying before Congress and you're arguing that the Constitution defined a person, it said, what is it? The number of whole people excluding Indians, not taxed, and 3/5 of all other people, basically, is kind of what the language was. I didn't get the language exactly right.
Madison was careful not to put slavery in there, and the other drafters, because they knew it was morally wrong. They were dealing with the times that they had. So.
Well, then I get why didn't they just take us? I'm like, because it was simply that, a compromise. You have states, like you said, God bless your state of Pennsylvania, which I did a show recently. I just think this is so fascinating. I know he was going to bring this in at some point. I think the Second Amendment was just simply about they didn't want standing armies. And what's funny is in the new Constitution of Pennsylvania, ratified just as they go into 1776 and they go into what we're now celebrating, they write hunt Bambi, home protection. They first use language relative to the First Amendment rights, and then they come back and say, and keep your weapons and home protection, all the things that weren't explicitly said. Then they said, we do this because you get a despot and a standing army, everybody loses liberty, basically. So Pennsylvania said it all. And then I'm like, if you're writing the Second Amendment, 27 words, and, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Okay. People are like, well, it just means you can have them. No. Now, I do think it meant the Commonwealth of Virginia and the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania could regulate firearms, knock yourself out. There is no incorporation doctrine in the 20th century following the 14th Amendment yet. So these aren't applied to the states. But Pennsylvania is also protecting the people's right to bear arms within their own constitution. So, and then a good friend of mine that who's PhD from UVA in foreign affairs, he made a good point. He said, you ever think about the sequence? Second Amendment, don't take the weapons. Third Amendment, don't stay in our house, quartering act. Fourth Amendment, probable cause. How does one get a search warrant? How does one arrest on a warrant? Or how does one? It's because of what the British did. And you think there are people like, hey, you're basically of the same race and religion we are. How do we know the new leaders aren't going to do what the old leaders did? We're no longer subject to the king. How do we know you guys aren't going to come take our weapons or come sleep in our beds and the rest? So it makes perfect sense that these become the Bill of Rights because it's the very concerns they have. They didn't defeat a foreign nation. They broke away from a nation of their own people. So all of those are concerns.
No, I think that was the whole point. Like Jefferson, in his summary of the rights of British America in 1774, which became a really popular essay at the time, and kind of and that led to him being chosen to go to the Continental Congress, I think, in part, and write the Declaration. He was saying, hey, we're not trying to do anything new here. We just want the rights that we're supposed to have as British citizens.
Exactly.
And you're taking them away from us. So that's like the French Revolution was kind of, we want to destroy everything.
Yes.
We want to destroy the church, the Catholic Church. We want to destroy the monarchy, and we're going to have a 10-day week instead of a 7-day week because that's about the Bible and all that stuff. So they went crazy, and of course, a lot of death came out of that revolution. They were just killing everybody off who was in the establishment. But
that's why I think it's. As far as political commentary goes, it's 1848, but I think Bastiat's The Law is like the best thing to ever read when it comes to the function of government, like laying it out pretty succinctly and getting it and nailing it. And, Bastiat's writing against collectivism in France at a time he's dying of tuberculosis. And, he pretty much nails it.
And one other thought came to me as you were talking about the Second Amendment and its true purpose. It's not hunting or
right.
It's self-protection and protection against tyranny. And what we're seeing in Iran right now is a perfect case in point. Probably, at least that sense when there were all these demonstrations going on at the beginning of the year and other times, there's maybe probably a majority of the Iranians that don't want to be under their regime anymore. But it doesn't matter because
they have no firearms.
The military, they have no firearms, and the military has the monopoly on that. And so you can have 5 or 10% of the population controlling the rest because they've got the power. And by reports, killed tens of thousands of people for protesting. And the Second Amendment is vital to maintaining liberty. But I really like the way you expressed that the Bill of Rights was just, it was a reaction to what the British had just done. Like, we're not going to be having them doing this anymore, or that, or that, or that.
Well, and then that whole argument between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, and reading the Federalist Papers, and there were a lot of clergy like, wait, if you put this first, and of course there were hundreds proposed. It went down to 12 votes. One of the two that was not ratified was ratified 202 years later, the 27th Amendment. It doesn't make it through ratification then, but in 1992 or something it does. And that's the one where you can't vote a new pay raise in Congress unless you've gone through another cycle of elections. But I've actually been in the National Archives with a buddy of mine that used to work there, and this guy was bringing out in these covered, clear cellophane papers, the actual writings of Madison in pencil, where he struck things and wrote things, and it's crazy to look at. But anyway, that back to that thing about the Second Amendment and kind of the purpose. I think another thing where it's clearly shown is when it comes to the Navy in Article 1, Section 8, it's 6 words, and it basically said provide for a Navy, which wanted a standing Navy. Then when it comes to Army, raise armies only in times of military need, never for more than 2 years. So you could vote the bastards out if an unpopular Congress vote for a war. But it's all these gyrations and things that have to be done to raise the state militias. So it'd basically be a skeleton army, and then they would raise the state militias in times for military need, which would also make it cumbersome for Congress to make war. But what did you always have standing? The Navy. And I've made this point. There was the Marine Corps before there was the Army. So the Marine Corps is 1775. And it's interesting, Jefferson, who was always such a stickler for the Constitution, when he comes into the Barbary Pirates situation, oh my, what will I do? He sent the Marines. Because they're basically, when you think about it, they're federal troops. And I was telling a friend the other day, I said, do you know who was at the taking down of John Brown at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, now West Virginia, at the arsenal at Harper's Ferry? Well, who? I said, Robert E. Lee. Lee was there? I said, yeah, as a full colonel. You know who he carried? He carried Marines. He was in charge of a bunch of Marines. Now you think about it, why Marines? Well, you weren't going to get you weren't going to necessarily get the Virginia militia to come in there and take care of it. So if you were needing, and it was kind of a federal issue. It's a guy going state to state, abolitionist, nut, whatever anybody wants to call him, but he's out there messing around. And who do they bring in? Robert E. Lee and the Marine Corps. So I think the Marine Corps was designed to always figure if you needed land forces that were sort of, the Marine Corps aren't part of a state militia. They're not called upon as a state militia, but they are ground forces, and they are part of the Navy, which is a standing aspect of the United States military. They're not contemplating the Air Force yet. So, I mean, when you think about it, it was Army, Navy, Marine Corps. And the Marine Corps, I think, fills that function of federal troops when necessary. That's my take. And it's back to states could regulate the firearms any way they wanted to. But most likely they would have said, keep your firearms, hunt Bambi, do whatever you want, and come to the church every once in a while and drill with the rest of the militia when the pastor tells you or the parson tells you to come and show up. That would have been the duties. And they also played police. The local communities played the police function, which has all been lost.
No, it does make me think of Eisenhower during the Little Rock crisis, where he called in the 101st Airborne. I mean, I know you're making a separate argument, but he was concerned that the local government there, that the police, certainly the police, and potentially the National Guard. He nationalized the National Guard to enforce this court order, which I believe was certainly constitutional and under the God, nature laws of nature's God right too. That all races should be treated equally. In Christ, there's neither male or female, Greek or Jew, but anyway, it talks about all the people of the earth are God's children, and His creation, that sort of thing. But yeah, he called in the 101st Airborne to make the point, this is being enforced, and the National Guard will better get online, and this is the way it's going to be. And then he gave a really powerful speech, explaining his actions. People say, oh, he should have been more forthright in civil rights, but he did make the moral argument, and not just that it was a constitutional order, but that it was right, and that it set a bad example to the world when we treated people differently when we're in the middle of this Cold War. And then Kennedy even, he went into it even in more depth. He made a more in-depth moral argument than Ike did, but both of them made the moral argument. So.
Yeah, I wrote my master's thesis on the Kennedy assassination, which everyone listening is going to go, he's going to go there somewhere at some time. But yeah, of course, I've done a lot of
Kennedy,
study.
He's on the cover of my book.
Yeah, and Oswald did it, by the way. But he is a complex character or a complex figure in American history, because I've read the editorials and I've really looked into it. He has been so romanticized as a figure, particularly by the left and journalists and college professors. People forget just how unpopular he was. And when it came to the legislation for civil rights, he was weighing, I got to get reelected. He won Texas by 43,000 votes. And that whole trip to Texas in large part was, you got a fight between Yarborough and Connally and Johnson. Johnson and Connally were considered more conservative Democrats. Connally, clearly, and Ralph Yarborough was the lefty. And they're fighting over who's going to be in whose car and who's going to go to the breakfast table together. So he's trying to go down there and shore up Texas, which is a large electoral college vote. But I think people look back and go, oh, Kennedy was loved. Kennedy would have won by a landslide in 1964. There's no guarantee of that. And if he keeps pressing matters as it related to civil rights, he might have lost the entire South. And I don't know. It was tough.
No, yeah, they were definitely trying to, walk that tightrope of recognize. And Martin Luther King and that movement was bringing pressure on the administration. The I Have a Dream speech was in August of 1963.
That's right, late August.
And they were concerned that was going to potentially turn violent, and that would help hurt. That would not look good for the administration. And so he like Eisenhower had sent troops in to enforce at the college level. Little Rock was high school, but at the college level, Kennedy had sent troops in and FBI people to deal with that. So, I think, you're right about that.
It's hard for people to imagine what things were like at a particular time in history if they didn't live in that time. So what you have to do is, you can turn on YouTube and you can look at the news reports, but if you can read and try to get as objective, but this idea, I think if you go to rank and file people on the street, even, I was a year and a half when he was killed, you were not yet born. And the people that were around, like my parents who lived to be 92 and 91 are gone now, they had a real grasp of what was happening at the time. But the number of people really old enough to really have a grasp of what that time frame was like are long. I mean, they're going. So if you don't look to the contemporary takes on things, the news footage, how things were covered, and that's where I've gotten a lot of it. You really see the criticism of Kennedy in that time. He was not the popular figure a lot of people would like him to make him out to be.
No, I just recently listened to Doris Kearns Goodwin book about her. Richard Goodwin was her husband.
Yeah, and hung out with Bobby Kennedy a lot,
And he had served in Jack's administration, and then he got into some trouble because some thought he had met with Cesar Chavez, or he'd met with one or two people.
He ran strong left, I think. Yeah, he ran on the left pretty hard. Yeah,
he's a communist and whatever. And so, of course, Doris paints him as a really good guy, but because she loved him. But
she's a Red Sox fan, so I'll give her that. She's okay.
Yeah, no, and I loved her account. I've listened to her book on leadership too, where she looked at
she's a sharp
of the
lady.
present. And so she she talked about LBJ too, and certainly John Kennedy, but LBJ, she really liked LBJ, and she worked for him after he left the White House, and she worked for him in the White House a little bit as a very young woman, and then helped him get his memoirs together and stuff. And so it's like Nixon going to China, as this very cold warrior willing to go to China.
Right.
LBJ, after John Kennedy was killed, he got behind the Civil Rights Act, and maybe he was for it a little bit before, but he said, as a tribute to Kennedy, we got to pass this thing. And he used all of his arm twisting abilities, which were considerable. And he had quite a personality by her account, and others too. But, he was able to get the Civil Rights Act passed then that next summer before the election, actually. And
that's right.
And then he was elected in a landslide.
Landslide over Goldwater. And Goldwater, if you go back and watch, I think this might be some of the grounds for Ronald Reagan 16 years later. Ronald Reagan did a lot of spots for Goldwater. Now, Goldwater's a war hero. And that's the thing. You're military. I mean, you went to West Point, and I used to think, how did McGovern end up being the liberal that he was?
Well, wasn't he a bomber pilot?
He was a huge war hero. And I was saying this to a friend the other day. I'm like, okay, touche, you got me. Because I was like, I think military types would skew more like conservative. But man, some of the craziest people on the left sometime are the ones with the war hero backgrounds. Now, Goldwater was a libertarian. I mean, that's what he was, literally. He was a libertarian, but he too was a World War II veteran. I think also a pilot and highly decorated. He's that guy. I think he was a general in the Army Reserve when he was in the Senate, I think. I think he was a brigadier general. But anyway, I can check that out.
Sounds right, yeah.
Yeah, but
he came to West Point when I was there. They gave him the Thayer Award, which is to honor people who have had a major impact. Like Douglas MacArthur was the first recipient, but who's in the book too.
So you saw Goldwater in the 80s.
Yeah, so he was still I think he is still a senator, or maybe he just retired.
So he had to be up in age, though. He had to be up there a little bit.
This probably was around 87, 88.
Okay, he might have been late 60s by that time. Yeah, because, I mean, if he's a World War II veteran, he's probably born in the, somewhere in the late teens to early 20s. He might have been in that time range. But anyway, I saw a video where, there's the famous Daisy commercial where the little girl's picking the daisy and then everything blows up. They only run it one time. And, of course, that's famous where Johnson's implying you let the war nut, the warmonger guy take over. There's going to be nuclear weapons fired everywhere in the world. And Reagan came out and said, I'm sick and tired of the way they're treating my friend Barry, and I tell you what, Reagan had a presence. I know he was a 69-year-old man by the time he's elected, but Ronald Reagan in the 60s, coming off of Death Valley days, and he was maybe a B actor or whatever, but Ronald Reagan had a presence. He did. So he's in the dark suit. He's got all the hair then. He's looking good. And he's, stumping there for Barry. So Goldwater goes down. Then you get Vietnam escalated. You get Nixon run out. You get Ford. Interestingly enough, he was on the Warren Commission, right? And then he pardons Nixon, and you get Carter. So when you get Carter and it goes that direction, it's prime time to bring Reagan back. I mean, it's time for Reagan, I think, at that time. And like you say, I was arguing with a friend the other day. They didn't want to buy it. I'm like, the 80s were really good. It's my wheelhouse. It's my 20s. But I remember as the decade started, an officer and a gentleman, that every kid wanted to go to OCS, or they wanted to do, and then you have the Rambo films and Top Gun and at that time the Rocky movies were beating up on a Soviet guy, right. And it was that kind of country. It was starting to become that. And, and people can argue. I saw a chart the other day on race relations. Cosby Show's #1 in the country pretty much, right? And people seem to be kind of finding they want to paint Reagan as this guy putting everybody on the street and everybody's homeless because of Reagan. But the economic times seem to be better. And we beat the big bad, Soviet Union in the end. We outspend them, or whatever you want to call it. So I literally thought at the end of the 80s when Bush was elected, who I was not at all a fan of, but when he was elected, I'm like, man, the Democrats might really be done. Like, because all the Republicans have done is they've gone Carter to Reagan to ending this Cold War, basically. Now there's all these possibilities. and then it gets run right back in the ground. It's just like everything gets recycled all over again. But I thought they were good times. And my vision, remembering Reagan, were warm and fuzzy. Was there more going on bad than I know about? Probably, sure. But it seemed like the country had stabilized in a lot of ways. And, we had our figures and we had our negativity. But you're right. The movies were definitely pro-America. Everything was very pro-America.
Yeah, no, he came to West Point when I was there right after Reykjavik, as I recall. He had met Gorbachev, and it was also at the anniversary of around the anniversary of MacArthur's Duty, Honor, Country speech 25 years later.
Oh, yeah.
This was 86.
Yeah.
It was the last major speech he made, and we have to memorize part of it as cadets: duty, honor, country. Those three hallowed words.
Was it "Old soldiers never die; they just fade away"? That speech.
That's his other famous speech that he gave when he was leaving the military.
Oh, that was
Congress.
in Congress, though, wasn't it? Yeah. He gave
old
that in Congress.
Soldiers never die. Yeah, he was I don't want to say melodramatic, but he was dramatic. And
what's an interesting thing about Kennedy, and he gets into the assassination, and some of the people that go the theory they wanted to escalate the Vietnam War, and he wouldn't. And then there's a whole national security memorandum 263 in October 63 to start rotating troops home. And they were basically Green Beret types. They were just basically armed advisors. They weren't, ground troops, combat troops. But he meets with Douglas MacArthur. JFK meets with Douglas MacArthur.
Yeah, there's a picture of it at West Point in the library that I saw.
And the story I heard from the inside is he wasn't impressed by Douglas MacArthur. He's like, old guy. Yeah, number one in his class at West Point, 5 stars, but who's he? And they said when he gets in the room with Kennedy, he shakes Kennedy down and scares the hell out of him. And this is what they said. He said, Mr. President, do not get involved in a land-based war in Southeast Asia. You'll never get out. And then it shook him. And it shook him up.
Well, MacArthur had been, in charge of the U.S. forces in Korea. And so he'd seen it firsthand. And he had lived a lot of his life in the Asia world. He lived
absolutely
overseeing Japan. My grandfather was part of the occupation force and was served under him before the war ended in the Philippines, but at the end of, in 45, not at the beginning. But so no, he was, what I've read is that he actually admired MacArthur, but and there is a picture of him having that.
And maybe he did, and maybe the historical take I got, I heard that he was kind of like, the old guy's coming in, let me give him a shot, listen to it. He said, maybe it wasn't quite like that. But I will say this, my mom was born in 1931. She was in Charleston during the war, World War II. She had to wear dog tags to school. They used to tape the top of the headlights for fear that, they were illuminating from the air. They didn't, I guess they were German, U-boats right off. So she grew up in that time. All through World War II, she told me this as a child. She would knit blankets to send off to the troops. All of my grandmother's brothers, 6 of them were in the war. I talked about my dad's side. Well, on my mother's side, her 6 uncles on my grandmother's side, 4 were Navy, 1 was at the Battle of the Bulge, shot up in the Army, and the other was a Marine. So she's sending letters to these guys. And during the war, she had Douglas MacArthur's picture on the wall. She said she literally, and when he got fired by Truman, she hated him. And I remember as a kid, and my dad was, who had been military, he's like, Liz, if he's the president, and the guy's out there saying things, you got to, no, he was a great man. How dare it? So she never could stand Truman because he basically called MacArthur home. And she didn't like him for that. And I think a lot of America didn't like Truman for that.
I had a moment with MacArthur's legacy, you might say. So I mentioned the 25th anniversary of the speech. So literally on that date or thereabout, probably exactly the day, May is when he actually spoke. Reagan came in October, but in May, they brought us all into Eisenhower Hall, which is the big theater on West Point that can seat all of us, and 4,000, some of us. And so we're sitting there, and they're about to show us this video of putting together scenes from MacArthur's military career with the speech. So it was a nice documentary type thing as he spoke. And so, but before the camera began to roll, showing us this film, the announcement came, all rise as Mrs. General Douglas MacArthur enters the room. I'm like, what? And I thought, his wife is still alive. You know,
she lived to be 100, didn't she?
Yeah. So she was 88 at this point. So I just didn't realize she was considerably younger than him. And they had married when he was in his 50s and she was in her 30s. And they had a kiddo together, Arthur, and named for Douglas's father. But so I just thought, wow. And so then when she passed, I was living in Virginia Beach, and I'd been doing research for the book at the Norfolk MacArthur archives and a movie that I was writing at the time.
Then you probably met Jimmy. Did you ever meet Jimmy Goebel? You probably did. He's a buddy of mine.
Yeah, Zobel. Yeah, Zobel.
Goebel.
Yeah.
Or is it Zobel? Yeah, I guess it is.
Z-O-B-E. Yeah, I have.
Buddy. Yeah, it's right. But he was at graduate school with me at Old Dominion, and Zobel. I can't believe I said. Anyway, he was getting his master's degree in history when I was getting mine, and his dream was to get over at the MacArthur, and I think he's been at MacArthur ever since.
He's still there as far as I know. I've reached out for comment when I've written articles about MacArthur in recent years, and so
I haven't seen Jimmy in a long time, but yeah, he was one of my classmates, and he got his dream job, and I remember him having contact with the family quite a bit because we graduated. Got our master's in 93-ish. I was 93. I think he was the same. So it's been just 30 plus years. I think he had the job by the next year.
Yeah, he was a young guy when I was there. Yeah. I was there in the late 90s doing research.
Yeah.
And I got to know the center director too. And so when Mrs. MacArthur passed, she is buried next to her husband there in Norfolk.
Right. In Norfolk. Yeah.
So they had a private ceremony, and I'd been doing a fair amount of research there for a book and a movie I'd written that hasn't been made yet, but hopefully will someday, called The Return. But anyway, they said, okay, yeah, you can come to the private ceremony. And then I got to meet their son, and some of particularly one of the aides who had served with him in World War II was there. This was the year 2000 or so. And I had been interviewing people who had been on the Bataan Death March and stuff like that there in the late 90s. And so and some of that's in the book too, but so I was so thrilled to, that I got to meet his wife. And then like Omar Bradley, he died around 1981, as I recall. Yeah. So, I mean, he was the last of the 5 stars from World War II to still be living. And my little hometown in Pennsylvania is where Eisenhower's family's from originally. His father and grandfather and everybody lived there. And then they moved to Kansas when his father was in his teens. But Ike came back to that little town, Elizabethville, Pennsylvania, and he viewed, he went to the house that his parents had built, which is still there, and in the 1800s. And so.
Yeah, I remember he ended up at Gettysburg, where he spent his last days.
Yeah, he had a farm there, and so they bought that when he was in the White House. And I've been to that farm. It's part of the national park there, the Gettysburg National Park, and then the farm is a separate tour you can take.
I don't know if I'm right or not, but I kind of like him when it comes to the measurement of people who've served in the office. And the friend of mine that was the Vietnam veteran that I used to do radio with, I came in one day and something had happened. It was in the 90s. During the time we were in law school, something had happened where I would say a president was a little bit less than concerned about, I think, the life and death of certain troops or something like that. And I said, you know what? I was watching a thing the other night. The first time I saw it was in 1984, 20 years after the 64 Eisenhower and Cronkite on the beaches of Normandy. They played it in 84, and now it's on YouTube. You can watch it whenever you want. But I had just seen it. This is pre-YouTube. It's really kind of early internet. But somehow I'd seen this replay of the 64 black and white Cronkite and Eisenhower go to the beaches. And then they go into one of the offices and they got the big map on the board. And you can tell when Cronkite begins to talk about, he's like, we were supposed to go June 4 and then things are bad. Then our weather guy says June 5 is going to be a monsoon. So we're going to skip 5. And when I get up that morning, it's clear. And I'm like, son of a gun, he missed it. Boom. Then it comes in. He goes, boy, you got it right. So then we get, and he said it was the moon and it was the tide and it was all these things. And it was like a 4 or 5 day window. The only way they could get this invasion, or they'd have to skip and go to July, and they didn't want to. So he goes, I agree on the 6th. And as he's talking about it, Cronkite has that moment where he's like, and what were your thoughts? And he gets choked up. You can tell. I knew thousands of men were going to die. It had to be done. And I came back and I told Tony, I said, that's the guy I want to be president. Him.
Yeah, no, he bared that responsibility. You could tell, like, even they gave him a big award in London right after the war ended. And so he was there on this balcony with Churchill and the king, as I recall. I don't think the queen had not been taken over yet. Elizabeth, she was a princess still. But anyway, so he says, there's a humility that has to come with the idea of gaining accolades. I'm paraphrasing,
right?
Gaining accolades from the blood and sacrifice of others. And so with that recognition, he basically thanked them for the honor and everything, but he wanted to put it in the context of, I'm here because of the sacrifices that people made. And I thought the responsibility, and MacArthur writes about that in his memoirs too, where he said, he walked around the ship before they invaded the Philippines, the famous I have returned moment, where he wades ashore. And he said there was a universal sameness, as he walked the ship the night before. And, that sense of what the next day would hold. Would they be alive by that point in the next day for the soldiers? I mean, in all likelihood he would be, but he did go ashore that day. But he said, I went back to my cabin and I read those passages from the Bible that give me encouragement in those sort of situations. So that's where you ultimately, I think, have to go. It's like, I am in this position and God is the arbiter of life and death. I'm making the best decisions I can based on the knowledge that I have and the wisdom. And so, it's quite a responsibility, life and death, certainly at that scale. Yeah.
The famous picture where he's talking to the guys with the charcoal on their face and they're all marked up and they're one of the airborne units. I think it was 101st.
101st,
yeah.
101st.
So he's got
There's a picture of it in my book.
and he's punching them in the arm and shaking hands with them and they're all standing but looking and they've got, they're all decked out in their stuff. They're a camouflage stuff. And a woman who's an historian found one of the guys. And it was number 29 is what he had on. He's like 98 years old. And she finds him. And she said, was he pumping you guys up? Was he giving you some strategy? She goes, no, we were talking about fishing. I think he was talking, where are you from? And he goes, whatever.
Yeah, that sort of talk. Yeah.
Yeah. And it was like, wherever he was. Have you ever fished the lake at, yes, sir. And then they got into fishing talk and, cause I kind of know it from baseball too, which is not like war, but it's like any sport. You can imagine the coach before a game talking to the guys about, what they had for dinner last night. Cause what has to be done. And again, that's no comparison sports, but in sports people, people say, what do you guys talk about in the dugout? Like where we're going to go tonight or who had the best barbecue in whatever town. Aren't y'all talking about lay down the bunt or move? No, we're not. We're talking about something else in the dugout because we know what's going on in the game kind of thing. So I think that was his way of doing that man thing of, we all know that what's getting ready to happen is going to be really bad.
Pretty serious.
Let's talk about fishing. Let's go fishing.
Get our minds off of it. Yeah.
Yeah. And besides they've been, and this is what she said, the guy said, he goes, look, we had been drilled to the point of exhaustion, knowing what we're getting ready to do. Having that guy come out and care enough about us to ask us about fishing stories really meant a lot to us. He wasn't going to come out there and go, now, when you get to here, turn left and look for this. And they look at the guns are going to be on. That's not the talk at that point. The general's out there to say, let's take your minds off of this. The obvious, you're going to get shot at soon. They don't need to hear that. They already know that. Because we had trained to the point we knew the gig. We knew what was going to happen. And we knew all contingencies. If this goes, we go to this. And that was already taken care of. I did want to say this too, because I thought it and I just looked it up. Eisenhower's mother's from
Pennsylvania. I forget which one.
Virginia.
Okay.
I thought she was born during the Civil War, May 1st, 1862, Mount Sidney, which is in Augusta County. And she was a pacifist. Like she was from one of the religions or one of the groups that, and I was talking to a friend the other day. And that's been brought up about the whole abolitionist Pennsylvania and the rest. I'm like, well, look at the people there, and many of them moved down, Eastern Mennonite universities in Harrisonburg, Virginia. There's a lot of the same groups of people or certain particular religious groups that migrated down the mountains into Virginia. So it's a lot of the same connection of people. So it doesn't make, I did think, I was like, I think Eisenhower's mom's from Virginia. She is. She's from the northwestern part in the mountains, very close to where is now West Virginia. So she would have been from that region. Yeah.
Yeah. One of his grandmother's name is Motter, which is a very common name in my little valley.
Oh, really?
I mean, where the Eisenhowers were from. So when I looked at the people that his grandfather married and whatever, I was like, oh, these are the same names of the type of people that I went to school with. And, so it really makes you, there's a little plaque out there saying that this was the Eisenhower ancestral home. And so, but yeah, Ike. He's the only West Pointer on my cover. Ike is on there.
She was Ida Elizabeth Stover. Yeah. And I do find it fascinating too. You probably would back me on this. I think he was a full colonel. And as they say, was it rifted out? He was going to kind of like not make next grade. Then the war starts to kick up and he goes from 06 to 11, right? He goes all the way to 5-star general before the war's out. So in a pretty short period of time, he makes all those ranks. And it's been argued he wasn't the greatest strategist. He was good at handling personalities. The different generals. He had a certain amount of political reining in of Patton, I guess. But when you kind of look at it, I don't know. Victor Davis Hanson is pretty good at storing this said over and over. Anybody that's not really in the know on this, believe me, Patton was the best general there in Europe. He was by far the greatest at doing what needed to be done to win the war. And people can probably differ on that, but I think he was pretty strong.
No, I have a chapter about Patton. I love Patton. The first day we showed up at West Point, they were playing his speech. I had seen the movie before, George C. Scott, Best Picture in 1970, as I recall. And so they played that speech. Men, I want you to remember when you go into battle, it's just this big battle speech. Yeah. And I have a chapter. And he had been, Ike benched him, to use some sports terminology. He benched him for 11 months. Mm-hmm. So Patton had fought in North Africa and then Sicily, and then they were getting ready to invade Italy. And that's when, he had the slapping incident, where he slapped a soldier who was at the hospital, for combat fatigue. Basically he had I don't want to say a nervous breakdown, but he was PTSD, I guess you can call it now. But, Patton said he was trying to just kind of buck him up, and that was his excuse. And it happened twice, as I recall, but it's portrayed in the movie. And, Eisenhower, basically, they relieved him shortly thereafter for a time. But then by the time, so there was Normandy, then D-Day. And then at the end of July, they brought Patton to Europe for the Third Army was being built or designated among the troops. And they, okay, you're in charge of the Third Army, it was called. And he was like a spring at that point. He was just so ready to launch that with this opportunity that he just went like a banshee, and their army charged across Europe and of course into the Battle of the Bulge, and that was where his heroic rescue of the 101st Airborne at Bastogne, the Third Army did that. And so he went, that's where his hero status was really established during those last 9-10 months of the war. And that I have my grandfather served for a few months under him, and then he was one of those few numbers that served in both the Pacific and the European and the Pacific theaters of war, because he'd gotten into the European theater so late. They did it based on each soldier was given a points system, like, oh, you've been out of the country for this long. And so that made you a higher priority to be sent back to the U.S. or shipped overseas. So my grandfather obviously had a very low points total. So he was shipped, halfway across the world to the Philippines. But he had the distinct, from my mind, he got to serve under two of my heroes, both MacArthur and Patton. So that was fun.
The thing about Patton too, when I think about the way the movie depicted the slapping, there's like no other footage of that actual footage to my knowledge. So it's just, hearsay stories. But you almost think in that generation, especially the friend of mine that was a Vietnam veteran, when he told me what happened to him or what he witnessed going through basic training, that's actually wrong. You don't say that in the Marine Corps, right? They call it, what do they call it? Infantry recruit training, whatever the term. I think basic training is a no. But anyway, when he went
they always have their term.
Yeah, they have right. Yeah, because I
terms.
remember hearing a Marine say it's not basic training, or somebody said basic training is like, well, he clearly wasn't a Marine. But anyway, when boot camp, when you're going through boot camp, whatever it was called, oh my gosh, the stories he told me about drill instructors in 1968, it was so bad. A lot that this one drill instructor did. He said after going to Vietnam and coming back, he sees him in a bar, and now he's a corporal. And of course, this guy's still a gunnery sergeant. And he goes up and he goes, I'll never forget this guy, 6'5" from Alabama. He told me this story. He goes up and he goes, hey, he goes, corporal gave his name and he goes, what's up? What can I do for you? And he goes, I just can't believe some of the inhumane things you did and blah, blah, blah. And he goes, hey, did you survive the Nam? And he goes, I did. And he goes, and I did my job.
No,
But then he said, but some of the stuff you did, and he said, son, the reason I did that is I wanted to dehumanize Marines, because when somebody's brains get blown on you, you either shoot or shit. And I wanted you to live. So if I could dehumanize Marines, and now you're under fire, it's horrible. But he said, the reason we trained you this way, and I say that to say that it's kind of interesting in the 1940s when people were pretty hard scrabble, especially the ones. The fact that he slapped, because the way they depict it, he's emotional and he's pinning the Purple Heart beside the kid who's lost his eyes, or he's got the head bandages. And then what's wrong with this guy? Mm-hmm. I just can't do it anymore, sir. Like, what? I'm sorry. Where's the wound? I don't have one. You little son of a, that guy's over here in this condition. Pop. And I would kind of think 1940s America wouldn't have been as much of, I don't know. I mean, you know what I'm saying? I would have thought that would have been kind of like, hey, that's Patton. He's a tough dude. And when he sees the guy that's crying in the corner and another guy's wounded, may not ever have eyesight again, I kind of get where Patton's coming from. I thought it was kind of interesting for the times to have been, he to have been seen that way for slapping a soldier. But I'm sorry, you were going to say on that.
No, yeah. He did have to apologize, and that, that's portrayed in the movie, but it's also in biographies of him and everything. So they had to call all the people who were on duty at that time and the soldiers in that unit and everybody. And he went and he tried to explain, he apologized and he tried to explain.
And to that soldier himself.
Yeah. He had to do that too. Yeah.
But how did that guy receive that? You have any idea how he received that?
No, I don't know, but Patton was just explaining that, I was just trying to kind of instill in him a buck up and a courage. He said, he wrote about his own experiences in World War I, Patton, and he was, under enemy fire, and he had taken cover. And he said, I felt, he was afraid. He didn't want to go forward. And so, then he said the idea of being shot in the face was the most terrifying thought to him. But he said he felt like his ancestors were saying, "You got to get up and go," and you've got to be who you've destined to be, which is a courageous soldier in battle. And so he was able to kind of overcome his fear, according to his account, and I'm sure it was true because he had a good record in World War I. And his son came, George Patton III, maybe, and spoke to us at West Point. He had been a general during the Vietnam War, a high-ranking soldier. Yeah. So I got a little sense of the Patton personality, and boy, just like in the movie, in the movie they kind of dialed it back, but Patton would drop expletives pretty easily. And his son did too. And it was kind of funny. We're at this formal dinner and he's dropping F-bombs and whatever. This is son. And I have a date I've brought up from Central Pennsylvania. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is a little bit, when he spoke to us as as cadets, he had spoken to us at another time. Right. It's totally appropriate. You're used to the rough language, but in that setting with all of us nicely dressed, I thought, I wish he would be a little more tame, but I think his father was, I think he learned it from his father, but
That's a lot. Yeah. I've been around some people who had like really famous parents, and that has to be tough. It just
Yeah.
has to be, because I mean, actually, I remember at one time with a friend of mine I work with in sports, and I won't get into the sport or anything else, but famous dad, this kid's in college, and I'm talking to my friend, and I said, seemed like a really nice kid. He goes, yeah, but the emotional damage, not his father's fault that he lives with. I mean, imagine your dad's one of the most famous athletes in a particular field and you take up that sport. You might want to try another sport because all he hears is, hey, you're pretty good. You'll never be as good as your dad. It's like you're never going to be as good as dad. And I'm not talking about his dad was a figure. I'm talking about his dad was a on Mount Rushmore guy. So he's never going to be able to live up to that. He can't just go out and play the game. And because it's always going to be, hey, did you hear his last name? He must be son. Oh my God, he's son of. And then so I can imagine you're a general and you're General Patton. And I don't care how many wars you're in or how many medals you win, you're still his kid.
No,
and of course, some are going to be like, of course you made general or you got general grade. Look who your daddy was. I mean, I'm sure there's some of that too.
Yeah, Patton died within months, at the same 1945. He died not long. Of course, some think he was killed, but
that was another whole. I was going to say that's another whole show because what happened there with him? The way he died. There's a lot of conspiracies as to he had to be eliminated. And it was depicted in the movie when he didn't want to drink with the Soviet soldiers. I mean, they've come from the East and the West to crush Berlin, and that's the bastards we should be fighting. Like,
I know
those commie, and that he was getting tamped down on that too. Like, George, diplomatically, don't say these things. And he's like, well, we're fighting the wrong enemy. It should have been those guys,
Yeah, no, he in a sense, he loved war. And so,
yeah, I think that's true too. Yeah.
And he was sad to see it all end. And he writes that in his autobiography. He says, I regret that I won't be able to earn my pay anymore. So he had fashioned his whole life to be a war hero. I didn't get the sense, of course, who can know, but I didn't get the sense that the son was totally overwhelmed by that legacy. He had the same name and everything.
Right. Right.
But Vietnam, of course, was not World War II. And most people in the military, certainly when I was in, had a respect for Vietnam veterans because they had seen combat. And so I think within that community, and he lived to a nice old age. Douglas MacArthur's son was never a military person. William Manchester wrote in his autobiography or in his biography of MacArthur, that American Caesar, that the son took a different name for a while. He just didn't even want to live with that burden. And no, it is hard. You see that in actors and stuff too, but sometimes the children go on to be as big or bigger, but it is a burden. It seemed like Reagan's children tried to kind of shied away from, except for Michael. They kind of shied away from it.
Well, then, okay. The one was kind of, the daughter went all over
Patty.
The map, as I remember. But remember, the one son was very anti-dad's legacy, and then the other one got big in the conservative talk radio realm.
Michael. And I interviewed him a couple times over the years.
Yeah. And did he just kind of go silent? I mean, I don't remember. I haven't heard from him in years. Is he still speaking out or?
Michael, you mean?
Yeah.
No, well, he passed.
He did pass away last year.
Last
okay.
year.
Okay.
Because I wrote an article about that, but because I had seen him. Well, I actually had dinner with him one time. We went to the same church, and it was a Christmas dinner. And so he and his wife and daughter showed up later. The ceremony had begun. And so he sat down and we had a nice dinner together. I made some crack at him about, so what do you do? I know darn well you had a radio show and everything. Oh, I'm Michael. Yeah, no, I know who you are.
He died this year, January 4.
Yeah. So my friends with my dad, or my friend, my former boss was a good friend of his too. But so yeah, no, I saw him at CPAC maybe before COVID sometime, maybe the late teens there. Again, I happened to be eating lunch someplace and there he was. So our paths crossed a few times, but I did interview him formally with the Western Journal, who I write for.
Yeah, Ronald Reagan, the son, is now 68, born in 1958.
He goes by Ron. Are you still?
Yeah, correct. He
Um,
goes by Ron Reagan, and he is doing radio show host, television host, writer, independent politically, it says, et cetera, et cetera. His progressive views contrast that with his conservative father. So I've certainly seen him. I mean, he's one of those people famously in 2016 that's on one of those rolling Trump will never be president. I remember that. It's one of the last times I really remember seeing him. It's been 10 years, but he's on that commentary. Go ahead and mark my words. He will never be president in the United States. So when those people,
he was on MSNBC a lot.
Yeah,
I think he may have even been a regular contributor.
And that it was a whole joke that he was even going to run. What has my daddy's party become? This can't happen, et cetera, et cetera. So that's where he was. Okay, brother, it's been great. We went a lot farther, a lot longer. No. Yeah, we've kind of gone on and on here. So I've gone on. I know how I am, so I've gone on and on. But I really enjoyed having you. You're welcome anytime. Definitely want to stay in touch. How can people get your book? Please tell everybody about your book and how to reach you.
So yeah, it's just been out for about a week and a half. I definitely wanted to get it out before the 250th, and so there were all these challenges, but it finally came out. It's on Amazon. It will be at other places fairly soon, at Barnes and some of those. But right now, it's just on Amazon, and it'll also be on Audible soon. I'm having John Pruden, who did. He's the voice actor who did about Reagan, actually, The Crusader, which is what the movie Reagan was based on too. That book, Paul Kengor.
Right.
The same narrator is doing my book. He's a U.S. Army vet, so I thought he would be a perfect fit for this, and I liked his narration of that Crusader book. But so if you go
ahead.
Well, I have. You can find the links on X, True Social, Instagram, or even on my Western Journal. No, I guess it's not there, but those three places you can find the link. And if you search for "We Hold These Truths" on Amazon, it might pull up the 07 version, which you don't want that anymore because I've got some really good stuff in this one. That one has just 3 pictures on it, but this one has 9. So that's a good way to, and if you look at the date of publishing, it'll say 07, but get the newer, improved, bigger version. That's what you want right there.
And that will say 2026.
Yeah, it was June 23rd, 2026. So I felt great.
Okay. Yeah,
I felt great. I was doing it at the same time that Jefferson and Franklin and Adams were kind of finalizing the Declaration, writing and finalizing it. This is perfect, 250 years later.
Well, man, it has been a great pleasure to have you on. Any other parting words you would like to give the audience?
Nope. We live in a great country. The Declaration sets the vision. It's like our holy grail, and it's wonderful to be here and be an American.
When you say we live in a great country, I don't feel that anymore, but I run into great people, but I don't feel like it's the country you and I grew up in. I don't think it's that, and I don't know how we return it to it. So that's kind of that. It's not chicken or egg, but it's kind of like, which direction do we go? Do we try to do it at local level and then hope it expands? How much of the country can we see go the directions it goes? Because again, this from traveling. You go to some places, you wouldn't know it's a crazy world, but then you go to some places and you see it's not what it once was. Now with Washington, D.C., and I know you saw this recently, now there's vandalism as to the work that's been done on the reflecting pool out beside or between the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Memorial. I'm like, I used to love D.C. I used to park at the Arlington Cemetery a lot. I would go park at the cemetery, walk the Memorial Bridge over to the Lincoln Memorial, and hot-footed all the way to the Capitol. That was just my thing, and I would hit all the monuments and stuff. I grew up 70 miles from D.C., so I made trips to D.C. all the time. And having grown up, I'm no street guy, D.C. guy, but I know the city. I used to go there a lot. All my Washington Redskins stuff, I was in stadium at RFK when I was a kid. It was D.C. Stadium. So I loved Washington, D.C., and there's an energy about it, and there was the monuments and the history. And then here about 10 years ago, I got to the point I wouldn't go anywhere near it. It's like, why? I did go up in 2017, and I went with a friend from Minnesota that wanted to see it. And when we were at the White House, there's just crazy people protesting, doing all kinds of crazy stuff. This is pre-COVID, but Trump's in office. And I just kind of knew that's what it, but a lot of it that I used to remember about it had really changed for the worse. Like just aesthetically, the city looked dirty, bad. And
I think they've been improving it recently, though.
But and that's my thing. They're doing that, and people are protesting that.
Like we don't want a clean, pretty city. We want a trash.
Well, I mean, so apparently with this reflecting pool, he put in a blue liner at some expense or whatever, and they're out there. Somebody was telling me they're taking some kind of things and cutting it, and then they're throwing stuff into the water to contaminate the water. So people are actively trying to destroy the beautification of the city, our nation's capital. So we've lost the plot somewhere, you know. I don't know exactly what the answer is, but
yeah, there are leftists out there for sure. And
yeah.
The leftists have gotten more crazy. Although you had the Weather Underground and stuff in the 70s. And I mean, we've always had some little offshoots, but yeah, it's larger. There seems to be a larger contingent now.
And right around the time you're born, I remember telling college students once, I said, but I'm 6. But I remember I said this to one of my graduate school professors. Like, yeah, I remember 68. I was in the house and Cronkite came on and said, Dr. Martin Luther King's been let me back up. March 31. I remember Johnson saying he wasn't going to run for president. I was a weird kid. I was watching all this. But I remember
I was
Johnson
interested as a kid too.
Well, 31
Not
March,
that, but I was too young then, but yeah.
But 31 March, he's saying, I'm not going to run. And I'm really figuring out who Bobby Kennedy is. And I was already fascinated with the Kennedy assassination because my mom read all the books. And then King's killed. And then I'm walking across the living room floor on the morning after Kennedy's shot. And my dad, who's like feeding me the politics because I'm interested, he goes, Jack, they just shot Bobby Kennedy in LA last night. I'm like, wow. So I'm watching riots in the streets after King's death. I'm seeing Bobby Kennedy shot, and I'm seeing Vietnam on the news every night. And I told this graduate school professor, I just wondered what war I'd get sent to. And she's like, that's fascinating. You felt? I said, well, all my great uncles and grandparents and all, it was World War I or it was World War II. My dad got drafted in Korea. My uncle got drafted in Vietnam. Like, if you were a male at the time, you looked around, you're like, you're going to fight in a war. You just wonder which one's going to call your name kind of thing. But I look back and I think the country was literally coming apart at the seams in 68. Really.
Yeah.
The Democrat convention was, Chicago was a free for all. There's fights in the streets. It was a messy time. We got through it, but I was a 6-year-old. So I thought that's kind of the way the world was. I mean, it really did. So as we went through, go ahead.
No, I've thought that before too. When people were like, "Oh, we're just in these crazy times and and politics and divided," and I thought they got to go back to the 1960s and, like you said, all these political assassinations. And I actually quote Robert Kennedy Sr. and Jr. in the book, but Kennedy Sr. had a great quote about how tyranny is brought down by the individual actions coming together and creating a wave. Ripples turning into a wave. They have the quote at where he's buried in Arlington. And so I have that in the book. But no, I'm still a big Bobby Kennedy fan. And I was fascinated in college with the 1960s.
Yeah.
Because, that was, I guess, probably like kids are fascinated with the 80s today, probably.
Yeah. Yeah. Because having lived in them and you hear their take on it, you're kind of like, it just feels like yesterday to me. But one last thing on what you're saying about nothing new under the sun. I got a chance to do a show with Gerald Posner, Case Closed, on the Kennedy assassination. So like, he's big on the odds. I mean, he's a huge figure on that. And I reached out to him. He did a show, and I said, he told me about how the Boston Symphony's playing when they find out, and there's a recording of the conductor saying, "Sorry, folks, we have news that President Kennedy's just been shot." And you hear a gasp, and then they start playing the funeral song. And I said, what's crazy is, and I sent it to him right after that, and you can look it up on YouTube. There's a talk show the night of the assassination, the night of Boston. And they have a very left-leaning entertainer, singer, songwriter kind of guy. And he comes on, and brother, when you hear it, it's crystal clear. It's like you're sitting in the room with him, and it's 60 plus years ago. But the thing is the language, because that night they don't really know enough about Oswald, but they don't know. But the host was like, what do you think? He goes, it's those crazy right wingers in the South. The blood is on their hands.
Oh,
We got to tamp down hate speech. We're too divided in this country. And if you're listening to it, you're like, it's right now.
Yeah.
So this kind of romanticized that. We were watching Andy Griffith and the Beverly Hillbillies. It's 1960s and all this black and white TV. You listen to these two guys talk 9 hours after the assassination, and it sounds no different than anything you hear today. Nothing. And the guy literally said hate speech. Like, he used that term.
That this movie, Jesus Revolution, came out a couple years ago. Mm-hmm. There was a Jesus people movement there in the late 60s when the whole country seemed to be coming apart. Yeah. And so millions, reportedly millions, they don't know the numbers exactly, but there were certainly huge events happening. Even Billy Graham spoke at some of them. And, but a lot of people, a lot of different settings. California was kind of the heart of it. But, they were doing all kinds of ocean baptisms and stuff at Pirates Cove and in Orange County and what. And so a lot of people looking back think that what saved the country then is that movement. Millions of people or certainly was one of the reasons, that millions of people were coming out of leftist hippiedom and becoming born again Christians. And a lot of them are still with us now, as preachers now in their 70s, like Mario Murillo and a guy named Hal Saxon here in Phoenix is a leader in the Christian community who endorses my books. I've interviewed him before about the Jesus people movement. And Mario's, as I said in the book, and he just had a crusade in Stockton where he said, this is the greatest 4 nights we had in the last week of the thing. It was supposed to just be 4 days, but it went 4 weeks. And he said, the last nights were the greatest in my 50 plus years of ministering, that thousands of people are coming to these events. And there is polling showing, certainly among young men, especially, but people in general, the number of Christians has actually gone up for the first time in decades, really. It's been going down.
I believe that. I believe that.
And so if there is a salvation, I think it comes through revival. And that's what I argue in the last chapter of the book.
No doubt.
Revival and then reformation. And so you change policies, like even that court case the other day that Trump helped instigate, truthfully, or he certainly changed the policies. There are 2 genders, that people in sports are going to have males compete with males. We're not going to have biological males competing in female sports because it's not fair. And that's not the purpose of Title IX. And so that's a reformation. We were going one way and now we're coming back to the truth. 2 genders, keep them separate in sports.
But what strikes me about the very thing you're saying right there is you could say a president who just turned 80 who's saying, come on, we all know the biological truth, therefore I'm going to enact a law and it gets upheld. That's one thing. But we also, I believe, 40 years ago would have thought, if we had introduced that, no, we're going to have guys 6'3" that were a girl yesterday competing. We'd be like, whoa. That would be 99.3% of the population. You know what I mean? It wouldn't have even. So when the population swings back to, that's just not an unpopular decision by Trump or something upheld. It would be, no, we kind of all are on board with that, or a vast majority. It's one of those 90-10 issues. The fact that it's not a 90-10 issue, I agree with you. It's trying to take back some of the ground, but the fact that we have the percentage of people who do think it was okay that young males are out there destroying females in sports, breaking their faces with volleyballs and the rest, that's okay. If anybody can see it as okay, you're kind of like, there's something wrong with the society. When the society comes back to what would appear to be sanity, will be that much better. There's steps that have to be taken, but in other words, we can't legislate ourselves back to sanity. I just want to go back to the
politics
world where people don't see. Yes.
Politics is downstream from culture for sure. And
yes.
But yeah, there are positive, certainly the church is a positive cultural influence, writ large. Obviously there are good and bad churches, but and Christians.
Oh, that's another thing. Yeah, the church has got to be. Well, but I mean, the church has got to be reformed too, because I mean, I watched one of these YouTubes the other day about some of the stuff that's being said in churches, and it's crazy doctrine as it relates to, if you're going to align with this certain particular faith, this isn't it. You can make your own thing, or you can say it's a variation of the thing, but it ain't the thing. So, we're kind of there too.
Yeah. Charlie Kirk was one of the good Christian voices out there as far as on these issues. But yeah, and of course others are having to step in and take his place, and their TPUSA is going around the country and bringing great speakers and great events on these cultural issues. But I interviewed Riley Gaines here in Phoenix a while back when they delivered a petition to the NCAA president. The convention was happening here, and said, "Hey, we don't want men in our sports." And it was a powerful moment. And I know that she and others were, I'm sure, rejoicing yesterday.
I think you've probably seen this, as they say, the video that's gone viral of the guy that celebrated Charlie Kirk's death. And now he says that he does appreciate his death because it brought him into light of just how evil his life had gone. Have you seen this video?
Oh no! So he repented more or less of his earlier.
Oh
remarks.
Gosh, yeah. Mm-hmm. So he comes out and he said, a coworker said, "You hear Charlie Kirk got killed?" And he said, "Yes, the Nazi blankety blank blank should have died, whatever." And then he goes on. He goes, "And now I have to say that I am glad that Charlie Kirk died because it made me come to grips with what I had become. The very fact that I celebrated it, I resurrected my faith. I resurrected my like life with my family." And he goes, "All these are a result of his death." And he said, his life and the way he died woke me up to what I had become, this angry person. So it was basically, I hate the fact that he died the way he did, but he didn't die in vain because it changed my life. And it's powerful.
No, I think that's good. I hadn't seen that yet, but yeah, there's what a Bible passage to something like "Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints," or something like that effect. Mm-hmm. And I think that would try. Trump was spared. God had more work for him to do on this earth. And Charlie mentioned that in his July 4th message last year by millimeters, and he attributed it to God's providence. And then Eric Metaxas was speaking here earlier this month, or just last month actually now, but he was saying, he's a Christian writer, or a writer in general, conservative thinker, but he's a Christian also. But he was saying, we don't understand why God allowed Trump to live and Charlie to be taken. And, but I think examples like you're pointing out, God had another purpose. So he fit a lot of life into those 31 years. And of course it's left his wife widowed and 2 young children. So it's a tragic situation, but God has used it in powerful ways like you're describing. I think there are many stories probably that in his.
Well, he said part of what shook him up was the guy, I guess, that told him he just was killed. When he reacted the way he did, he said, "Have you ever listened to him actually and all the vast hours of video capture that you can find anywhere?" And he said, he's basically saying that's what struck me. No, I've never actually listened to what he said. I've only listened to snippets that were
to TikTok.
Yeah, right, exactly. But the reason I even brought him up is I was thinking about the fact, I wonder how many of the people, because when you talk about some of these tours and speakers, let's face it, often the entire audience is going to be people who are of like mind. And it'll kind of fire up the base and all that. But Charlie clearly was, Steven Crowder's done this. You go out on campuses, Change My Mind, or whatever these different things were that were being done. They're going into the belly of the beast. I mean, they're going
territory.
Right. And I've wondered how many others, because, famously there was the girl that exposed her breast to Charlie Kirk. You may remember that. Right. And that was with Vivek Ramaswamy was right beside him. And she was basically captured on video, I think, again. I believe the person was like, they're pretty sure it's her. And it was, "Yeah, I still hate him. I hope he's burning in hell." Kind of. So clearly where she was 2 years before his death, saying something along the line of, "Why you're out here picking on kids?" And he makes the point, "Are you a voter?" "Yes." "Well, then I'm talking to you." And he goes, "You listen to your professors. They're older than me. So why is it I'm the bad guy?" So he hands it to her. She doesn't really have an argument. She doesn't look really good in the video. I am wondering, though, are there many out there today who had been on these volumes of videos where they seem to be in opposition to him that have reflected later and changed their lives? I wonder if there's, because what I'm afraid is whichever side of people are on, again, you can have an event bringing a bunch of right wingers and conservative kids and all, and they're like, yay, our team, and that's great. Right. But that's why I did think that what Kirk did was clearly courageous. And if it was ever going to be any kind of dent in the machine or the direction that things might have been going, is to go to the people who don't agree with you.
No, that was his argument.
That was his argument, but I always kind of wonder what the numbers might be. Now, again, that viral video of this guy is one guy. He's clearly one guy. Now, I did see a barrage of videos following his death where a lot of people came out and said, I want to apologize for how I felt about Charlie Kirk, because after his death, I literally went back and actually listened to what he said, and I never had. And had a different view of what he was saying once I actually took the time to listen. So there was some of that.
Yeah. No, I saw some of those too. But yeah. No, he, of course, the youth vote swung pretty strongly in Trump's direction in 2024. Thanks in part to Charlie, and especially young men, and podcasts, like this and others helped influence young men. But but women came his way too, and I think a large part because of the sports issue was one of the issues pulling women in his direction. I think he gained 10 points with women, and overall he went from upper 20s or 30s among young people to 40% of the youth vote. So he didn't get the majority, but he got along. He made up a lot of ground.
I do a lot of shows with a buddy of mine, and we've actually done the theme of a couple of shows. I am of the mind that with Trump goes the party that it has now become, because I don't see an heir apparent. I don't think he's of the personality that has a handoff to guy. I just don't think. So what I think is going to, go ahead.
No, I've argued this before. Bush came after Reagan. Whenever you have one of these big reformers and big personalities that really shapes the American presidency, you're not going to get another one usually. And I mean, maybe you get one.
Reagan did not like Bush. I've even heard the story the Bushes were never even invited into the personal residential area of the Reagans. He did not want, there is actual documentation to show, very much like Jack Kennedy didn't want Lyndon Johnson. It was forced upon Reagan by the party. That's why
in 1980, I think, sure.
You're right. No, that's what I'm saying. 1980, Reagan didn't want anything to do with Bush.
They were rivals. They were both going at it.
Yeah. And, there were even people that say, hey, kind of funny how Jack Kennedy got killed in 1963. And, what was Bush's role in that? And then they're like, and then Reagan gets shot in 1981. I've even heard the stories that to her death, Nancy Reagan questioned whether the Bushes had something to do with it. But let me just say, they weren't exactly best friends. So, and I'm not saying necessarily, I do believe that Nancy Reagan to her death always kind of questioned. She wasn't a big fan. But I don't think, I'm not saying that Reagan and Bush, I think Reagan at that point in life, pushing 80, probably would have been like, I'd rather it be Bush than the next guy, Dukakis. But I don't know that he really had an emotional stake in it. What I'm saying about Trump has clearly changed the party in a decade. It's a completely different party. It has different constituents and all that, or it has a different base. I don't think he's the kind of guy that wants the party to be anything other than the party of Trump, is all I'm saying. I don't see a natural heir apparent. So what I'm afraid of is, or what I think is going to happen, this has been my argument, is that if the Democrats win the midterms, they're going to impeach him weekly. It's just going to make stuff up weekly. And I'm not sure eventually there won't be enough dissenting Republicans to get rid of him just to try to restructure the party. Knowing that,
I don't know.
Knowing that he's not going to run in 2028. So it's going to be some kind of food fight, I guess, to try to take over the party. But I don't see the party remaining what the party is now, because Trump did restructure the party. But in doing so, he ran out the establishment Republicans, and they've aged out. I mean, McCain, of course, passed away, but the McCains, the Jeb Bushes. Now, Rubio's still around. He picked on him. Ted Cruz is still around, but I don't see him being a figure ever again trying to get the nomination. So there's going to be a new slate of people, and what the Republican Party is going to be going down the road, I don't know. But this, I think, is always my fear of putting that much weight in figures like that.
Yeah, no, I think Rubio would be my pick at this point. Of course, I supported him in 2016 too. I mean, I gave a little contribution, whatever, but yeah.
No, I think a lot of people feel that way. Yeah, I think a lot of people feel that way. But I don't know if. But again, all I'm saying, like 2016, it's little Marco in the slights, and he insults Cruz's wife, and he insults Jeb Bush's wife, and he insults Jeb Bush every day. And it was good theater, and he wrested the party away from the establishment, clearly. And a lot of people felt good about that. But I don't know what that creates going down the road. I don't know what the Republican Party is going to be minus Trump. And there's going to be a minus Trump time.
Yeah, we'll have to see. But yeah, we'll see what happens. I'm not sure. But
yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure either. I'm just worried about the alternative. So, all right, brother. Anything else you want to say on the way out?
Nope, I've got some Trump in the book too. I didn't put any contemporary figures because he's so strong on the Declaration, and he had posted one in the office, but he had some really good stuff to say in his Mount Rushmore 2020 speech.
Yeah.
And then, since then, and the rededication of the nation to God, I have some of that in the book, and, that the May 17th thing. So, but I didn't put any contemporary figures on the book because I don't want to get any legal issues for one thing, but,
Sure.
But Trump probably would have been fine, but.
Sure.
Anyway, but no, thank you. Yeah, thank you. I've enjoyed it.
Yes,
Jack,
sir.
It's been great.
I've enjoyed having you on. Randy DeSoto, Jack Moore here with More to Consider. Please like and subscribe, comment. Please buy his book. Give that title one more time.
We Hold These Truths. Two
There we
Beliefs
go.
Change the World. You can find it on my social media or on Amazon. But again, just get the 2026 version.
All right. Thanks, everybody. God bless, and hope to see you again soon.
Thanks for tuning in. If you like the show, subscribe and hit your notification button to get an update when we post another episode. See you soon.